Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am very happy to be welcoming my guest today, who is Paul Weatherhead, author of Phantoms of Christmas Past. Welcome, Paul.
Hi Anna, great to be with you.
It is a very intriguing title, and I wonder what brought you to writing this book.
Well, I was many years ago, I was researching a book on local history and, looking for interesting ghost stories. And what I noticed was that in almost every region, when I looked at the newspaper archive going back to the 19th century, I'd pick up these strange stories of people dressing as ghosts, sometimes with just a white sheet over their head, or maybe, more elaborate costumes like luminous paint and devil masks and animal skins, and hanging around in spooky places like graveyards or quiet country lanes, and then jumping out and scaring people. And, quite often these sort of silly pranks would escalate into these huge ghost hunts with people chasing each other around the streets or these kind of ghostly riots in graveyards. And it struck me that this is a sort of a forgotten part of history, the way that people's love of the supernatural and people's sense of mischief would sort of come together and create these strange ghost hunts and ghost panics that soon became really sort of crazy, bizarre, hysterical panics that swept through communities and with comic consequences, with tragic comic consequences. And, when I came to, I'd always wanted to write a kind of Christmas ghost book. But, when you look at what's out there, it's been done so many times, true Christmas ghost stories and fictional Christmas ghost stories. So I thought this is something that hasn't been done before. The true stories of ghost hoax and ghost panics that sort of went viral, as it were, in the 19th and early 20th century. Because this phenomenon of faking ghosts, it was almost like a hobby that you'd find in every village, in every town, for over 100 years.
Hmm. Your introduction, I thought, was most interesting, and I'm just going to read a quote from it. The bleak midwinter is a border between the old year and the new, and borders have always had a mysterious exotic or magical quality. Folklorists use the word liminal to denote this threshold, and many of the true stories in this book have a liminal quality. This is because they exist in the border between reality and imagination, tradition and progress, vision and city, truth and delusion, life and death, past and present. And that really, when I read that, it really struck a chord because there is something from the moment we get into Samhain and everything is dying right through to the solstice that invites introspection. And it's very difficult to think about this in the summer solstice, for instance, where there's so much light, but something about the darkening of the days um, kind of makes us instinctively think about what we can't see. So the stories in your book are true stories. Are they all hoaxes, or are there some which might have some basis of mysterious truth about them?
Well, some of them are outright hoaxes. It's people dressed in a ghost costume. However, a lot of the stories, they're the reason why people dressed as a ghost, or the reason why people became afraid of this fake ghost, was because the area had some kind of ghost law already attached to it. So there was a sense of people, feeding into that, and that's quite often what happened. I mean, perhaps the longest running one that I write about in the book is a ghost with the splendid name of the clanking ghost of East Barnet. So there was already a tradition of this ghost of a knight from medieval times called Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, haunting the streets, and the rumors were that you'd hear the clanking of his spurs before you'd see him, hence his name, the clanking ghost. And in 1926, a watchman was guarding some building materials, and he said he saw this clanking figure come that looked like a skeleton in a red military cloak. And so that got in the newspapers. And after that, it sort of fed into these mass ghost hunts that descended on this part of London every Christmas. It became a Christmas tradition that we sort of forget now. But, you get hundreds, then thousands of people blocking the streets. Often they would be drunk because they see it as a kind of Christmas celebration, all hunting for this ghost that had been in the newspapers. And of course you get the psychic investigators coming down to investigate, and then you get the spiritualists coming down to investigate as well. And these two organizations didn't really get on with each other. And there'd be sort of resentment that all these London spiritualists coming down and stealing our ghost. And it got to such a state with all these crowds of celebrating ghost hunters coming down to this to East Barnet that people began to worry that people were scaring away the ghost rather than the ghost scaring people. So and that this Sir Geoffrey haunted the streets of London right up into the 40s. This happened every year from the 20s to the 40s. So there we don't have a hoax. We have a sort of a piece of ghost lore that suddenly burst into the newspapers, and then from there the sort of ghost hunts and ghost panic spread.
I love it. I that's absolutely hilarious. What were they trying to do? I mean, they can't have thought that they were actually going to catch a ghost. Is it that they were trying to determine whether the ghost was real or not?
It's an interesting question, because when you look at the newspaper archives from this kind of period, these kind of events, they're very haughty, very disdainful. They talk about how the superstitious masses could believe such rubbish in the 19th century with all the technology they had there. But I think they're missing the point. I think generally people came down because they were curious. They wanted to share ghost stories with their friends. They'd often go on these ghost hunts after the pub. And especially at Christmas time, it would be like a celebration. And, things did get out of hand, and it sort of erupted into a kind of riot, with people running around in graveyards, scaring each other, jumping out on each other, making ghostly noises. And the police would be called, but they wouldn't be able to keep order. It became like a very transgressive ghost hunting riot. So many of them wouldn't expect to see a ghost. They just came for the fun of it. Now, there were smaller groups of serious investigators, and they, of course, were really vexed by these party goers who were sort of jumping on the bandwagon and running around, scaring each other. And like I said, the spiritualists as well would also come into it. So yes, it was a crazy situation that happened again and again over the 19th century, and it was just such a sort of a forgotten part of history that I felt that there were stories here that needed to be told.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because what you've got there is a reputed ghost. So
Mm,
people's imaginations are already acting. And then you have somebody who hears something, and it may or may not have been a ghost. But then you add to that this cocktail of alcohol and imagination and the done thing, which now is every Christmas go look for this ghost. And it is quite a heady cocktail. that
Mm.
got there. It's very difficult to get any sense of what was really going on. So, can you give us an idea of what the difference between phantoms and ghosts is? Is there a difference between them? Tell us.
Yeah, well, I use the word phantom because it has a kind of ambiguity. On the one hand, it can mean a ghost, but on the other hand, it can mean something that isn't real. And many of the ghost stories in the book have um, are based around hoaxes. They have a kind of a Scooby Doo type ending, where it's somebody in a white sheet over the head. In fact, there's one, the story of the Lockheed ghost in Scotland, Dundee in Scotland, and that happened in the early 20th century. There were rumors of this tall ghost with this fiery red hat haunting the area. Now, this area was also known for the ghost of a murdered princess, so that sort of fed into the ghostly atmosphere. And it was so you had these huge gangs of ghost hunters roaming the streets at night trying to catch this ghost, who it was assumed was somebody in a fancy ghost costume trying to scare people. So you get these huge gangs of people roaming the street trying to catch the ghost. The ghost would always manage to escape, and it was rumored that he was, taking his costume off and hiding it in his pocket and then disappearing into the crowds. But it got to so bad that people were scared to go out at night. There were rumors that the number of weddings in the town dropped rapidly because young couples could no longer were too scared to go out courting. This was over the Christmas one Christmas early 20th century, and then in the end, a few people took their dogs out to try and catch the ghost, and finally, one guy chased down this person in the a white costume, and his dog, who was called Nettle, managed to grab the ghost costume and pull it off and reveal the culprit. So it really was like a little Scooby Doo solving the mystery of the Lockheed ghost. So you do get quite a lot of stories like that where there is a fake ghost because it was such a common activity, and it's hard for us to understand what would possess people to do that now, as playing the ghost. Now, as well as these, you would also get press hoaxes. The newspapers love to invent a ghost story, and if a rival newspaper printed it as facts, so much the better. Um, so there were all these things sort of feeding into, and they seem to be especially common around Christmas time.
I find it very interesting that the press were engaged in this. Um, what would the motive be for someone to start a rumor? Oh, obviously, actually, I'm answering my own question now. It would be increased sales, wouldn't it?
It would be increased sales, yeah, and it would fill. It's an easy way to fill column inches, and quite often there would be there'd be clues that they were telling a joke, that it was not meant to be serious. There was a really nice one in the early 20s where a newspaper put a report saying that the ghost of King Richard III appeared surrounded by a green mist to a drunk farmer coming home from the pub on New Year's Eve, and the ghost told this farmer that he was angry about the woodcutters chopping down trees on the hill where King Richard III had fought his last battle, and so this was printed in the newspaper. It was very tongue in cheek, so it was clear if you're reading it that that this was a joke. But when other newspapers summarized it and shortened it, all these tongue in cheek parts were lost, and so it was taken seriously. And so people started coming down to try and find the ghost of King Richard III, and the green mist that was haunting the hill where he died in battle in 1485.
Has any harm ever come from these events?
Yes, I mean, quite often the ghost hunters, as a little aside, the ghost hunters, would form gangs, vigilante patrols, because quite often that they knew it was somebody in a ghost costume scaring people, and so they would form a kind of vigilante mob. And if they caught him, he might be beaten, he might be thrown in the nearest river or the nearest sewer. Probably the most well-known one was the Hammersmith ghost of 1804, and then you still, because Hammersmith, it's part of North London now, but in those days it was a fairly rural area with orchards and farms on one side of it, so it made it easy for the ghost to escape. And when all these rumors started to emerge about somebody pretending to be a ghost in these backstreet lanes, you started to get these crowds gathering and forming committees and patrol groups. And incidentally, one of the best ghost costumes comes from the Hammersmith ghost, and that was on Christmas Day, 1804. A coach driver was driving down a lane in Hammersmith, and he heard this eerie rattling noise, and he looked to see this strange white figure making this horrible rattling noise. And the figure was covered from head to foot in these pig bladders that were filled with dried peas. It's hard to imagine, but that was a common toy at the time, a common children's toy. But anyway, that was one of the weirdest ghost costumes that I found. And the Hammersmith ghost became, so scary. People were staying at home. There were rumors that a pregnant woman had been scared to death by it, although that turned out not to be true. Finally, an exciseman decided to take the law in his own hands, and he went to the streets with a gun, waiting for the ghost, the figure in white, to appear. And when he was confronted by a strange figure in white, this was between Christmas and New Year, he challenged it. When it didn't answer, he opened fire, and he shot and killed a man called Thomas Millwood, who was a plasterer. And in those days, plasterers wore white work clothes. And so, and this caused another sensation. Already the Hammersmith ghost was a sensation, but now you had this tragic killing. And the guy who shot him, Francis Smith, he was sentenced to death and then reprieved at the last minute. And then, strangely enough, another man was arrested and charged with being the Hammersmith ghost. He was a carpenter called John Graham, and he said that he'd only done it the once. He'd only pretended to be a ghost the once, and he said his motive was that his apprentice had been telling his children these ghost stories, and his children were so scared that they couldn't sleep. So he decided to get his revenge by dressing as a ghost and scaring the apprentice. Now, it's pretty clear that there were so many of these episodes around Hammersmith in 1804 that John Graham couldn't have been responsible for all of them. But these panics often seemed to dissipate when a scapegoat was found. So, yeah, those are some examples of harm that was come to them. But occasionally people would be innocent people would be badly beaten. There was one case in Dundee where an insurance man was a door-to-door salesman, was running to meet his last appointment, and the crowd thought that he was a ghost who was running away after doing his business, and so they ran after him and nearly killed him. So it was quite common for that sort of thing to for these episodes to get out of hand.
What do you think changed that made these sorts of incidents kind of disappear?
I wonder if it's the change in media, because in the early 20th century, when you heard one of these stories, or same if there was a local murder or something, people would go and congregate at the scene because that was the best way to get fresh, up-to-date information and to share your own experience and your own ideas about, the ghost rumor or the murder or whatever. But when you started to get radio and then TV and then the internet, that kind of gathering at the location of something just doesn't seem to be as necessary as a way to exchange information. I think maybe the nearest thing that we had to it in recent years would be after the death of Elizabeth II, where people sort of congregated around Buckingham Palace. So maybe that sort of is the same kind of thing, but I don't think it's died out completely. But I think I think it's just not as intense, it's not as frenzied, it's not as dangerous, hopefully, as it was back in those days.
I was also wondering about, lighting in streets as well, whether that has made it less likely because we can see more clearly and perhaps less of the imagination is engaged.
Yeah, street lighting at the time would have been sporadic, gas lamps. It would have been dark and gloomy, and a lot of these ghost panics happened in regions that were sort of where the growing city meets the countryside that was feeding the city. So we talked about liminal spaces before, and that's where you've got the sort of the rural part, the village and tradition, and then you've got the modern urbanizing part. So I think there does seem to be that element to it because a semi-rural area allows the culprit to make his escape over walls into hedgerows, and I think and the dark lighting just adds an extra sort of gloomy atmosphere compared to more modern street lighting.
That's an interesting point that it hadn't occurred to me to ask you, did any of these events actually happen in the middle of town? Larger towns.
Yes, they did. Because in larger towns, especially ones where they have lots of narrow alleyways, labyrinthine little passageways that the ghosts could escape into. So they happened all over the place, really, in big towns and little towns. I think the biggest ones tended to happen, like I said, in sort of on the outskirts of cities, but they did happen in town centres as well. I mean, they happened all the year round in summer and spring as well. But as you were saying near the beginning, something seems to happen round about September, October, when the nights are getting dark, um, and so that seems to be the best time to conduct a ghost hoax because you've got more darkness to play with, and then these seem to escalate, and then peak round about Christmas and New Year, and that might be partly because the newspapers more willing to explore these stories because they wanted a ghost story for Christmas at that time.
Are there any ghost stories that you've come across where it's not been man-made and it's easy to see that there's something going on?
Well, not so much in the stories that I looked at because generally I was looking for hoaxes and panics. But here's something spooky that's quite hard to explain. One of the stories in the book is about the Peterborough poltergeist. That and When I talk about poltergeist, I talk a little bit about playing poltergeist Cluedo. Which member of the family was responsible for faking the crashing noises and so on. But um, one person who tried to investigate the poltergeist in Peterborough was a man called W.T. Stead, and he was a very famous newspaper editor in Victorian times. He was sort of very almost invented tabloid campaigning journalism, and he wrote a short story. He didn't end up investigating the Peterborough poltergeist because it was clear to him that it was a hoax. But he was actually a spiritualist and a believer in the supernatural, and he wrote this story about a huge ocean liner called the Majestic, and and on the ship he gave the captain the name of a real captain, um, and based the character on him. And in the story, a psychic on this ocean liner has a vision about a ship colliding with an iceberg. Um, Several years later, um, the captain who W.T. Stead based this story on and gave him the same name did become the captain of an ocean-going liner called the Titanic, which did go down after hitting an iceberg, and W.T. Stead was one of the passengers who perished on the Titanic. So that's a kind of spooky coincidence that's very hard to understand or to grasp what was going on there.
It is indeed. Very interesting. I'm also wondering because the late 19th century and the early 20th century did see a great interest in the paranormal because we have the spiritualist churches really beginning to flourish. And of course, there's the College of Psychic Studies that Arthur Conan Doyle was involved with. I think he may even have set it up. I'm not too sure of that, but he certainly was very heavily involved with it. Is it that, well, maybe the question I'm asking is, it's very clear that in that period in history, there was a maybe a resurgence or a real curiosity in this topic. Do you think that our interest remains the same, or do you think that materialist views have educated it, and I put that in parentheses, um, out of us?
I think we still have that same interest, and um, I think in the stories that I look at, where these vast, I call them ghost flash mobs, descend on a location to um, where there's rumors of a ghost. I think that people were curious. They loved the idea of the supernatural. They weren't necessarily firm believers or firm skeptics. Um, they fell somewhere in between. They were curiosity seekers. I think they just enjoyed the idea of ghosts and hunting ghosts and the excitement. And I think that's still with us in very many ways. You can tell by people watching uh, those those shows where people go to haunted houses and you've got all those spooky night cams and so on, and crashes and noises, and and people still go to seances and visit haunted houses, do tours of haunted houses. So I think people still have that kind of interest. And it's funny you talk about the resurgence of interest in um, the paranormal that happened in the 19th and early 20th century, because it was interesting that you get these kind of rivalries in them, and that's part of the backdrop of the book, because you have the Society for Psychical Research, where led by various eminent scientists and included Arthur Conan Doyle. But when the Arthur Conan Doyle sort of led a mass resignation from the society when he thought they were being too skeptical of spiritualist mediums. So you've got that kind of tension between them, and that tension sort of plays out in the background of the book, between the rivalry of people trying to do these Society for Psychical Research type investigations, maybe using technology like cameras or telephone to communicate with each other on their ghost hunts, and the spiritualists who would have a seance, and then they would always find a ghost. And so you got the societies, investigative societies, being sort of jealous that the spiritualists would always find a ghost and get all this positive press, and they were there with their equipment, and they had much less luck.
That's made me laugh. It didn't occur to them that the equipment might be the problem.
Yes.
And it didn't occur to them to ask, what are they doing right? Well, it is a most entertaining book, and I would highly recommend it. The title, of course, is Phantoms of Christmas Past. Paul, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Anna. Thanks for having me.
If people want to find out more about your work, how do they do that?
They can check out my website and blog, which is paulweatherhead.com. So I post regular articles about strange history, mass hysteria, social panics, and that kind of thing there.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. I'll be putting a link to that as well as the book in the description box, in which you will also find links to my own websites and my Substack. And if you would like to receive my newsletter from my Life Astrologer website, do subscribe. In there, you will find lots of information about astrology and any other aspects of my work, events, courses, etc. Until next time, goodbye.